The question is, how do you tie your hands behind your own back and then kill yourself? Strange suicide, but that's what the police in Richmond, BC called the killing. She was a 44-year-old nurse, Cindy James, who'd reported over 100 terrifying threats and incidents in the years up to her death. But when her body was found, what seemed so obviously a sadistic murder wasn't obvious at all.
She was so afraid to tell me something. And she said, I need help badly, but I can't tell you, Mum. If I do, I'm afraid for you.
On the 25th of May, 1989, 44-year-old Cindy James disappeared. She was last seen at a suburban shopping mall in Vancouver, Canada. Her car was found abandoned in the parking lot. Inside her vehicle were groceries and a gift that had been hand-wrapped. Alarmingly, there was blood on the driver's side door handle. Items from Cindy's purse were found scattered underneath the car. In the days that followed, frantic search efforts by police and Cindy's family failed to come up with any answers. 2 weeks later, on the 8th of June, road construction workers made a grisly discovery. Next to an abandoned house on the side of a busy highway lay the body of a woman decomposing in the summer heat. The body was confirmed to be that of Cindy James. She was located only a few miles from where she was last seen. Cindy's body showed multiple signs indicating that she was murdered. Cindy's hands and feet were tied behind her back. A nylon stocking was tied tightly around her throat. Her arms had needle marks, and an autopsy would later reveal that her body had been pumped with a lethal dose of morphine. To Cindy's family, this was the moment they had long feared. Cindy's death brought to an end nearly 6.5 years of relentless torment, where she claimed she was being harassed, threatened, and physically attacked by an unidentified stalker. Despite all this, investigators would conclude that Cindy's cause of death wasn't murder and was, in fact, suicide.
The theory was possibly she went out and she bought the pantyhose, and then she went and she injected herself and she drank all this stuff down, and then she tied herself down, walked over 1.5 miles, lay down in the bush, all tied up, and died. That's a terrific story, isn't it?
Cindy was born in Ontario in 1944 to parents Otto and Matilda Hack. She was the eldest of their 6 children. By all accounts, Cindy was a happy child and very bright student. After high school, she would go on to pursue a medical career and would graduate from nursing school in 1966. While Cindy was attending nursing school, she met 39-year-old Dr. Roy Makepeace. Dr. Makepeace had taken a keen interest in the then 19-year-old Cindy. Despite him being married at the time, the two quickly became close and developed a sexual relationship. When Cindy informed her parents of her relationship with Dr. Makepeace, they were appalled, citing Roy's age difference as their main concern. Despite this, Roy divorced his wife in 1966, and later that year would marry Cindy. In July of 1982, after 16 years, their marriage ended, which, according to those close to the couple, was an amicable separation. Cindy was reportedly happy to end the marriage and move on with her life and career. Cindy would move into a house by herself. This would be the first time in Cindy's life that she would live on her own. Shortly after settling into a new home, Cindy's life took a very dark turn. In October of 1982, 4 months after Cindy and Roy had separated, Cindy began to receive a series of disturbing and threatening phone calls. Sometimes the calls consisted of nothing but silence or heavy breathing, while other times, the caller would whisper obscene and violent threats. The caller's raspy voice was unfamiliar to Cindy. However, the caller knew her name. The following audio is a recording of the caller's voice.
Cindy.
Cindy stated that one night after one of these phone calls, she had an eerie feeling of being watched and proceeded to close the curtains. Immediately after doing this, the phone rang again and the caller stated,
"Don't think pulling the drapes means I don't know you're in there."
Cindy claimed she heard prowlers outside her home at night. On several occasions, the lights on her front porch were smashed and a brick was thrown through her window. One night, she came home to find that the pillows on her bed had been violently slashed, but when Cindy tried to call the police, her phone line had been cut. Bizarre threatening notes began to appear on Cindy's doorstep. The notes were crudely made from magazine clippings.
In the last 8 years, she didn't know what a normal existence was like. She couldn't go outside her door and feel safe.
Cindy had reported these incidents to the police, but without a suspect, the police weren't able to offer much help. Officer Patrick McBride was one of the first attending officers on Cindy's case. One evening, whilst evaluating an incident in Cindy's home, McBride mentioned that he was looking for a room to rent. Cindy offered to sublet one of her bedrooms to McBride, and given Cindy's circumstances at the time, it probably wasn't a bad idea to have a police officer living in her house. Not long after moving in together, the two began dating. Despite having Officer McBride living in her home, the harassing phone calls continued. McBride had witnessed some of the phone calls and, on one occasion, even managed to start tracing a call. The call was too short to finish tracing, however, it did indicate that the call came from somewhere near the Vancouver airport. The romance between Cindy and Pat McBride wouldn't last long. After only dating for a few months, McBride asked Cindy to marry him. Cindy was surprised by McBride's proposal, and she explained that she wasn't ready to take the relationship further. The pair separated and McBride would move out, and once again, Cindy would be living on her own. Not long after McBride moved out of Cindy's home, the first of several violent incidents occurred. One evening in January 1983, Cindy's friend Agnes Woodcock dropped by Cindy's home unannounced. Agnes knocked on Cindy's front door, but there was no answer. Noting that the lights were on and Cindy's car was in her driveway, Agnes went around to the back door. There, she found Cindy collapsed at her basement stairs with a nylon stocking tied tightly around her neck. Cindy's memory of the event was hazy. In her statement to the police, she said she heard a knock on the back door, where she was greeted by a man she didn't recognize. She was then dragged to her garage where another man was waiting for her. The stocking was tied around her neck and she lost consciousness. When giving a statement to the police, the investigators felt that Cindy was being evasive and not telling them the full story. Because of police suspicion that Cindy had staged the event, the attack was not investigated further and no evidence was gathered. In an effort to evade her attacker, Cindy moved to a new house, painted her car a different colour, and changed her last name from Hack to James. Despite these measures, the harassment continued and became even more grotesque. Over a 1-month period, 3 dead cats were placed in Cindy's front yard, one with a note around its neck reading, "You're next." Police set up surveillance outside Cindy's home several times, but no incidents occurred during the periods of surveillance. As soon as the police withdrew, the attacks would immediately resume. To the police, this added more weight to their suspicion that Cindy was staging the attacks herself. Cindy's family noted that the reason the attacks didn't occur during the periods of surveillance was likely due to the obvious police presence outside Cindy's home. The marked police vehicles would have been easily noticeable by her attacker.
We would say to them, well, you know, if it's somebody doing that, sure as heck he knows you're there. And of course, nobody will do anything while you're sitting there and watching.
With the mutual mistrust growing between Cindy and the police, Cindy hired private investigator Ozzy Caban. Ozzy brought a lot of experience to the table. After finishing his career with the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, he opened his own high-profile security and private investigation firm, which provided security for politicians, celebrities, and even royalty. After Ozzy learned that Cindy had been unable to call the police due to her phone line having been cut on several occasions, Ozzy gave Cindy a two-way radio and told her to keep it on at all times so she could alert Ozzy if she was being attacked. Late one evening, in January 1984, Ozzy heard strange sounds coming over the two-way radio and rushed over to Cindy's house. Ozzy found Cindy unconscious on her kitchen floor with a knife penetrated through her hand.
I didn't know what I had, so I kicked the door in and entered. I found blood in the kitchen. I found her lying in the hallway where the radio was. I checked for a pulse. As far as I was concerned, she was dead. I saw the knife through her hand. There was a note on the knife stating, "You're dead, bitch," or something along that line. Nobody could have done that to themselves.
Cindy told police she was standing in her kitchen when she was hit in the head with a piece of wood. She was then grabbed from behind and a needle was injected into her arm, and then she lost consciousness. The police were immediately suspicious of the event, and again, they didn't gather any evidence, not even fingerprints on the knife that was penetrated through Cindy's hand. Even Ozzy was puzzled by the scene he was confronted with. When Ozzy arrived at Cindy's house, he had to break the door down due to it being locked, which raised the question about how the attacker, or attackers, managed to gain entry into her home. However, Ozzy was frustrated by the police concluding that the attack was staged. Ozzy pointed out that the angle of the needle insertion into Cindy's arm would have made it impossible for Cindy to have injected the needle herself.
Nobody, but no one, can come to me and give me any kind of rational explanation as to how she could have done it herself.
Late one evening in July of 1984, Cindy left her house to walk her dog in a nearby park. Approximately 4 hours later, she knocked on a stranger's door begging for help. Cindy recounted that she was stopped by a man who asked her for directions, and she was then dragged into a van. Inside the van was another man and a woman with blonde hair. She was then drugged and lost consciousness. 2 needle marks were on Cindy's arms, but a toxicology report would show that she didn't have any drugs in her system apart from her antidepressant medication. Cindy and Ozzy confronted the police about the lack of progress on the case. The police explained that they had exhausted their leads and persons of interest, and they reiterated their suspicion that Cindy was withholding information from them. The case was sent for an internal review, and it was determined that the reporting officers had done all they could to ensure that Cindy's case was adequately investigated. But Cindy's ordeal was far from over. In December 1985, Cindy went missing and would end up being found in a ditch beside a highway, 6 miles from her home. Cindy was semi-conscious and suffering from hypothermia. She was wearing a man's work boot and glove, and a nylon stocking was tied around her neck. She had multiple cuts and bruises. Cindy had absolutely no recollection of how she got there. During one night in April of 1986, Agnes Woodcock and her husband Tom were spending the night at Cindy's house. Cindy often had the couple stay at her house to help her feel safe. Late during the night, Cindy awoke Agnes and Tom saying that she heard a noise downstairs. Tom said that he'd also heard a noise. The three of them went downstairs to investigate and found that the basement was on fire. Agnes tried to call the fire brigade, but the phone line had been cut. Tom rushed out on the street to find help, where he found a man standing in Cindy's yard. Tom asked the stranger for help, but curiously, the man ran away without saying a word. When authorities investigated the arson, they couldn't find any sign of break-in. The dust and cobwebs on the basement windows weren't disturbed. Authorities concluded that the fire must have been started by somebody who was already inside the house, which would in turn lead them to believe that Cindy had staged the event. Agnes and Tom defended Cindy, saying there was no way that she could have started the fire while they were in the house. Cindy accused her ex-husband, Dr. Roy Makepeace, of starting the fire. However, Roy had an airtight alibi, as he was in South Africa at the time when the fire occurred. Cindy would be evicted from her home due to the fire, and in the months that followed, Cindy's mental state began to deteriorate. In mid-1986, Cindy attempted to starve herself to death, which would lead her to being committed to a psychiatric ward. Whilst being treated in hospital, there was conflict amongst the doctors as to whether or not the attacks were manifested by a mental illness, or if she was legitimately being harassed by a third party. Doctors were unable to agree on a definitive diagnosis of a serious mental illness. During her stay in hospital, Cindy wrote a letter to her family and revealed just how much of a toll the harassment was taking on her. She wrote, "I still feel that suicide is my best option in an unbearable situation, and as soon as I get out of here, I will carry out my plan." Cindy was released in July of 1986 and continued therapy as an outpatient. Cindy told police that she firmly believed that the harassment was being orchestrated by her ex-husband, Dr. Roy Makepeace. Police encouraged Cindy to confront Roy over the phone and record the conversation.
Are you denying it?
Oh my God. I am certainly denying it. I always have denied it. I have absolutely nothing whatever to do with it.
Police had committed a lot of resources to investigate Makepeace, going as far as to put undercover surveillance on him several times. But nothing incriminating was ever found, and Roy did have solid alibis for most of the incidents of harassment. Over the next few months, Cindy's mental state showed considerable signs of improvement, and for a while the harassment appeared to have ceased. But a serious blow was dealt to Cindy when she lost her job at Blenheim House due to poor work performance. Blenheim House was a specialised hospital for children with behavioural issues. Cindy had been working there since 1975, and it formed a huge part of Cindy's life and identity. Friends and family stated that Cindy was devastated that she was no longer going to be working there. But Cindy managed to get back on her feet quickly and began working as a nurse at Richmond General Hospital in late 1987, at which time the harassment resumed. Cindy reported that she would come home to find smashed windows and her basement door broken, and just like before, her phone line had been cut. For added safety, Aussie Caban gave Cindy a panic button that would alert Aussie's company if she was in trouble. One night in October of 1988, Cindy would press the panic button. When help arrived, they found Cindy halfway in her car, naked from the waist down. She was tied up with her hands and feet behind her back. Cindy would be taken to hospital in a coma. When the police were able to interview Cindy, she claimed she didn't have any recollection of the attack.
I remember thinking, oh my God. And then I don't think I really remember anything else.
Again, police concluded that Cindy had staged the event and tied herself up. However, a not expert claimed it would have been impossible for Cindy to have tied herself up in the position that she was found in. In May of 1989, 6 years and 7 months after Cindy had first reported the harassment, Cindy would disappear for the final time. In total, Cindy had reported nearly 100 incidents of harassment to the police, including the 6 major physical attacks. In part 2, we'll take a closer look at the theories and suspects in Cindy's death.
This is probably the most baffling case that I've ever come across.
I call it a non-investigation because it was not an investigation to determine, in my mind, what caused our daughter's death. It was an investigation to try to get evidence to pin it on her herself.